Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Alexandra, Salix, Heather, Silka, Electric Maynard, and Star Trekkin'. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you supported in the month of July, you and everyone else who supports us by becoming a member of Patreon or dropping us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com will be entered into a raffle at the end of the month, the prize for which is an exclusive episode made just for you. And because it's just for you, copyright restrictions do not apply, so if you ever wanted to be bored by the joy of cooking or a brief history of everything, this is your chance. If you'd like to help this podcast and be entered into that raffle, you'll find links for Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, by request of several of your fellow listeners, let's return to the natural history of Pliny, translated with copious notes and illustrations by the late John Bostock, M.D., F.R.S., and H.T. Riley, Esquire, B.A., late scholar of Clare Hall, Cambridge. First published in 1856 by Henry G. Bonn, York Street, Covent Garden, London. For this reading, let's take a random dip into Book 18, which deals with agriculture, and learn about the seasons, the importance of the stars, and a few ways to foretell the weather. Let's begin. Chapter 56: The Proper Times for Sowing. We now come to a subject which has been hitherto deferred by us, and which requires our most careful attention: the proper times for sowing. This is a question that depends in a very great degree upon the stars, and I shall therefore make it my first care to set forth all the opinions that have been written in reference to the subject. Hesiod, the first writer who has given any precepts upon agriculture, speaks of one period only for sowing, the setting of the Vergiliae. But then he wrote in Boeotia, a country of Hellas, where, as we have already stated, they are still in the habit of sowing at that period. It is generally agreed by the most correct writers that with the earth, as with the birds and quadrupeds, there are certain impulses for reproduction, and the epoch for this is fixed by the Greeks at the time when the earth is warm and moist. Virgil says that wheat and spelt should be sown at the setting of the Vergiliae, and vetches, kidney beans, and lentils at the setting of Boötes. It is of great importance, therefore, to ascertain the exact days of the rising and setting of these constellations, as well as of the others. There are some again who recommend the sowing to be done before the setting of the Vergiliae, but only in a dry soil and in those provinces where the weather is hot. For the seed, they say, if put in the ground, will keep, there being no moisture to spoil it, and within a single day after the next fall of rain will make its appearance above ground. Others again are of opinion that sowing should begin about 7 days after the setting of the Vergiliae, a period which is mostly followed by rain. Some think that cold soil should be sown immediately after the autumnal equinox, and a warm soil later, so that the blade may not put forth too luxuriantly before winter. It is universally agreed, however, that the sowing should not be done about the period of the winter solstice, for this very good reason. The winter seeds, if put in before the winter solstice, will make their appearance above ground on the 7th day, whereas if they are sown just after it, they will hardly appear by the 40th. There are some, however, who begin very early, and have a saying to justify their doing so, to the effect that if seed sown too early often disappoints, seed put in too late always does so. On the other hand, again, there are some who maintain that it is better to sow in spring than in a bad autumn, and they say that if they find themselves obliged to sow in spring, they would choose the period that intervenes between the prevalence of the west winds and the vernal equinox. Some persons, however, take no notice of the celestial phenomena, and only regulate their movements by the months. In spring they put in flax, the oat, and the poppy up to the feast of the Quinquatria, as we find done at the present day by the people of Italy beyond the Padus. There, too, they sow beans and winter wheat in the month of November, and spelt at the end of September, up to the Ides of October. Others, however, sow this last after the Ides of October, as late as the Kalends of November. The persons who do this take no notice, consequently, of the phenomena of nature, while others again lay too much stress upon them, and hence by these refined subtleties and distinctions only add to their blindness. For here are ignorant rustics, not only dealing with a branch of learning, but that branch astronomy. It must still, however, be admitted that the observation of the heavens plays a very important part in the operations of agriculture, and Virgil, we find, gives it as his advice that before anything else we should learn the theory of the winds and the revolutions of the stars, for as he says, the agriculturist, no less than the mariner, should regulate his movements thereby. It is an arduous attempt, and almost beyond all hope of success, to make an endeavor to introduce the divine science of the heavens to the uninformed mind of the rustic. Still, however, with a view to such vast practical results as must be derived from this kind of knowledge, I shall make the attempt. There are some astronomical difficulties, however, which have been experienced by the learned even, that ought to be first submitted for consideration, in order that the mind may feel some encouragement on abandoning the study of the heavens, and may be acquainted with facts at least, even though it is still unable to see into futurity. Chapter 57. Arrangement of the stars according to the terrestrial days and nights. In the first place, it is almost an utter impossibility to calculate with a fair degree of accuracy the days of the year and the movements of the sun. To the 365 days, there are still to be added the intercalary days, the result of the additional quarters of a day and night. Hence it is that it is found impossible to ascertain with exactness the proper periods for the appearance of the stars. To this we must add, too, a certain degree of uncertainty connected with these matters that is universally admitted. Thus, for instance, bad and wintry weather will often precede, by several days, the proper period for the advent of that season, while at another time it will last longer than usual. The effects, too, of the changes that take place in the seasons will sometimes be felt later, and at other times earlier, upon their reaching the face of the earth. And we not unfrequently hear the remark made upon the return of fine weather that the action of such and such a constellation is now completed. And then again, as all these phenomena depend upon certain stars, arranged and regulated in the vault of heaven, we find intervening, in accordance with the movements of certain stars, hailstorms and showers, themselves productive of no slight results, as we have already observed, and apt to interfere with the anticipated regular recurrence of the seasons. Nor are we to suppose that these disappointments fall upon the human race only, for other animated beings as well as ourselves are deceived in regard to them, although endowed with even a greater degree of sagacity upon these points than we are, from the fact of their very existence depending so materially upon them. Hence it is that we sometimes see the summer birds killed by too late or too early cold, and the winter birds by heat coming out of the usual season. It is for this reason that Virgil has recommended us to study the courses of the planets, and has particularly warned us to watch the passage of the cold star Saturn. There are some who look upon the appearance of the butterfly as the surest sign of spring, because of the extreme delicacy of that insect. In this present year, however, in which I am penning these lines, it has been remarked that the flights of butterflies have been killed 3 several times by as many returns of the cold, while the foreign birds, which brought us by the 6th of the calends of February every indication of an early spring, after that had to struggle against a winter of the greatest severity. In treating of these matters, we have to meet with a twofold difficulty. First of all, we have to ascertain whether or not the celestial phenomena are regulated by certain laws, and then we have to seek how to reconcile those laws with apparent facts. We must, however, be more particularly careful to take into account the convexity of the earth and the differences of situation in the localities upon the face of the globe, for hence it is that the same constellation shows itself to different nations at different times, the result being that its influence is by no means perceptible everywhere at the same moment. This difficulty has been considerably enhanced, too, by various authors, who, after making their observations in different localities, and indeed in some instances in the same locality, have yet given us varying or contradictory results. There have been 3 great schools of astronomy: the Chaldean, the Egyptian, and the Grecian. To these have been added a 4th school, which was established by the dictator Caesar among ourselves, and to which was entrusted the duty of regulating the year in conformity with the sun's revolution, under the auspices of Sosigenes, an astronomer of considerable learning and skill. His theory, too, upon the discovery of certain errors, has since been corrected, no intercalations having been made for 12 successive years. upon its being found that the year which before had anticipated the constellations was now beginning to fall behind them. Even Sosigenes himself, too, though more correct than his predecessors, has not hesitated to show, by his continual corrections in the 3 several treatises which he composed, that he still entertained great doubts on the subject. The writers, too, whose names are inserted at the beginning of this work, have sufficiently revealed the fact of these discrepancies, the opinions of one being rarely found to agree with those of another. This, however, is less surprising in the case of those whose plea is the difference of the localities in which they wrote. But with reference to those who, though living in the same country, have still arrived at different results, we shall here mention one remarkable instance of discrepancy. Hesiod, for under his name also we have a treatise extant on the science of the stars, has stated that the morning setting of the Virgiliae takes place at the moment of the autumnal equinox, whereas Thales, we find, makes it the 25th day after the equinox, Anaximander the 29th, and Euctemon the 48th. As for ourselves, we shall follow the calculations made by Julius Caesar, which bear reference more particularly to Italy, though at the same time we shall set forth the dicta of various other writers, bearing in mind that we are treating not of an individual country, but of nature considered in her totality. In doing this, however, we shall name not the writers themselves, for that would be too lengthy a task, but the countries in reference to which they speak. The reader must bear in mind, then, that for the sake of saving space, under the head of Attica, we include the islands of the Cyclades as well, under that of Macedonia, Magnesia and Thracia, under that of Egypt, Phoenicia, Cyprus and Cilicia, under that of Boeotia, Locris, Phocis, and the adjoining countries, under that of Hellespont, Chersonesus, and the contiguous parts as far as Mount Athos, under that of Ionia, Asia and the islands of Asia, under that of Peloponnesus, Achaia, and the regions lying to the west of it. Chaldea, when mentioned, will signify Assyria and Babylonia as well. My silence as to Africa, Spain, and the provinces of Gaul will occasion no surprise, from the fact that no one has published any observations made upon the stars in those countries. Still, however, there will be no difficulty in calculating them, even for these regions as well, on reference being made to the parallels which have been set forth in the 6th book. By adopting this course, an accurate acquaintance may be made with the astronomical relations, not only of individual nations, but of cities even as well. By taking the circular parallels which we have there appended to the several portions of the earth respectively, and applying them to the countries in question that are similarly situate, it will be found that the rising of the heavenly bodies will be the same for all parts within those parallels where the shadows projected are of equal length. It is also deserving of remark that the seasons have their periodical recurrences without any marked difference every 4 years, in consequence of the influence of the sun, and that the characteristics of the seasons are developed in excess every 8th year, at the revolution of every 100th moon. Chapter 58. The Rising and Setting of the Stars. The whole of this system is based upon the observation of three branches of the heavenly phenomena: the rising of the constellations, their setting, and the regular recurrence of the seasons. These risings and settings may be observed in two different ways. The stars are either concealed and cease to be seen at the rising of the sun, or else present themselves to our view at his setting, this last being more generally known by the name of immersion than of rising, while their disappearance is rather an occultation than a setting. Considered again in another point of view, when upon certain days they begin to appear or disappear, at the setting or the rising of the sun, as the case may be, these are called their morning or their evening settings or risings, according as each of these phenomena takes place at daybreak or twilight. It requires an interval of 3/4 of an hour at least before the rising of the sun or after his setting for the stars to be visible to us. In addition to this, there are certain stars which rise and set twice. All that we here state bears reference, it must be remembered, to the fixed stars only. Chapter 59. The Epochs of the Seasons. The year is divided into 4 periods or seasons, the recurrence of which is indicated by the increase or diminution of the daylight. Immediately after the winter solstice, the days begin to increase, and by the time of the vernal equinox, or in other words, in 90 days and 3 hours, the day is equal in length to the night. After this, for 94 days and 12 hours, the days continue to increase, and the nights to diminish in proportion up to the summer solstice. And from that point, the days, though gradually decreasing, are still in excess of the nights for 92 days 12 hours, until the autumnal equinox. At this period, the days are of equal length with the nights, and after it they continue to decrease inversely to the nights until the winter solstice, a period of 88 days and 3 hours. In all these calculations, it must be remembered, equinoctial hours are spoken of, and not those measured arbitrarily in reference to the length of any one day in particular. All these seasons, too, commence at the 8th degree of the signs of the zodiac. The winter solstice begins at the 8th degree of Capricorn, the 8th day before the kalends of January in general. The vernal equinox at the 8th degree of Aries, the summer solstice at the 8th degree of Cancer, and the autumnal equinox at the 8th degree of Libra. And it is rarely that these days do not respectively give some indication of a change in the weather. These 4 seasons again are subdivided, each of them into 2 equal parts. Thus, for instance, between the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox, the setting of the lyre on the 46th day indicates the beginning of autumn. Between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice, the morning setting of the Vergiliae on the 44th day denotes the beginning of winter. Between the winter solstice and the vernal equinox, the prevalence of the west winds on the 45th day denotes the commencement of spring, and between the vernal equinox and the summer solstice, the morning rising of the Vergiliae on the 48th day announces the commencement of summer. We shall here make seed time, or in other words, the morning setting of the Vergiliae, our starting point, and shall not interrupt the thread of our explanation by making any mention of the minor constellations, as such a course would only augment the difficulties that already exist. It is much about this period that the stormy constellation of Orion departs after traversing a large portion of the heavens. Chapter 60. The Proper Time for Winter Sowing. Most persons anticipate the proper time for sowing and begin to put in the corn immediately after the 11th day of the autumnal equinox at the rising of the crown, when we may reckon almost to a certainty upon several days of rainy weather in succession. Xenophon is of opinion that sowing should not be commenced until the deity has given us the signal for it, a term by which Cicero understands the rains that prevail in November. The true method to be adopted, however, is not to sow until the leaves begin to fall. Some persons are of opinion that this takes place at the setting of the Vergiliae, or the 3rd day before the Ides of November, as already stated, and they carefully observe it, for it is a constellation very easily remarked in the heavens, and warns us to resume our winter clothes. Hence it is that immediately on its setting, the approach of winter is expected, and care is taken by those who are on their guard against the exorbitant charges of the shopkeepers to provide themselves with an appropriate dress. If the Vergiliae set with cloudy weather, it forebodes a rainy winter, and the prices of cloaks immediately rise. But if, on the other hand, the weather is clear at that period, a sharp winter is to be expected, and then the price of garments of other descriptions is sure to go up. But as to the husbandman, unacquainted as he is with the phenomena of the heavens, his brambles are to him in place of constellations, and if he looks at the ground, he sees it covered with their leaves. This fall of the leaves, earlier in one place and later in another, is a sure criterion of the temperature of the weather, for there is a great affinity between the effects produced by the weather in this respect and the nature of the soil and climate. There is this peculiar advantage, too, in the careful observation of these effects, that they are sure to be perceptible throughout the whole earth, while at the same time they have certain features which are peculiar to each individual locality. A person may perhaps be surprised at this who does not bear in mind that the herb pennyroyal, which is hung up in our larders, always blossoms on the day of the winter solstice. So firmly resolved is nature that nothing shall remain concealed from us, and in that spirit has given us the fall of the leaf as the signal for sowing. Such is the true method of interpreting all these phenomena granted to us by nature as a manifestation of her will. It is in this way that she warns us to prepare the ground, makes us a promise of a manure, as it were, in the fall of the leaves, announces to us that the earth and the productions thereof are thus protected by her against the cold, and warns us to hasten the operations of agriculture. Chapter 61. When to sow the leguminous plants and the poppy. Varro has given no other sign but this for our guidance in sowing the bean. Some persons are of opinion that it should be sown at full moon, the lentil between the 25th and 30th day of the moon, and the vetch on the same days of the moon, and they assure us if this is done, they will be exempt from the attacks of slugs. Some say, however, that if wanted for fodder, they may be sown at these periods, but if for seed, in the spring. There is another sign, more evident still, supplied us by the marvelous foresight of nature, with reference to which we will give the words employed by Cicero himself: the lentisk, ever green and ever bent, beneath its fruits, affords a threefold crop, thrice teeming, thrice it warns us when to plough. One of the periods here alluded to is the same that is now under consideration, being the appropriate time also for sowing flax and the poppy. With reference to this last, Cato gives the following advice: burn, upon land where corn has been grown, the twigs and branches which are of no use to you, and when that is done, sow the poppy there. The wild poppy, which is of a utility that is quite marvelous, is boiled in honey as a remedy for diseases in the throat, while the cultivated kind is a powerful narcotic. Thus much in reference to winter sowing. Chapter 62. Work to be done in the country in each month respectively. And now, in order to complete what we may call in some measure an abridgment of the operations of agriculture, it is as well to add that it will be a good plan, at the same period, to manure the roots of trees and to mold up the vines, a single hand being sufficient for one jugerum. Whereto the nature of the locality will allow it, the vines and the trees upon which they are trained should be lopped, and the soil turned up with the mattock for seed plots. Trenches, too, should be opened out, and the water drained from off the fields, and the presses should be well washed and put away. Never put eggs beneath the hen between the kalends of November and the winter solstice. During all the summer and up to the kalends of November, you may put 13 under the hen, but the number must be smaller in winter, not less than 9, however. Democritus is of opinion that the winter will turn out of the same character as the weather on the day of the winter solstice and the 3 succeeding days. The same too with the summer and the weather on the summer solstice. About the winter solstice, for about twice 7 days mostly, while the halcyon is sitting, the winds are lulled and the weather serene. But in this case, as in all others, the influence of the stars must only be judged of by the result, and we must not expect the changes of the weather, as if out upon their recognizances, to make their appearance exactly on certain predetermined days. Chapter 63. Work to be done at the winter solstice. Be careful never to touch the vine at the winter solstice. Hyginus recommends us to strain and even rack off wine at the 7th day after the winter solstice, provided the moon is 7 days old. About this period also, the cherry tree, he says, should be planted. Acorns, too, should now be put in soak for the oxen, a modius for each pair. If given in larger quantities, this food will prove injurious to their health, and whenever it is given, if they are fed with it for less than 30 days in succession, an attack of scab in the spring, it is said, will be sure to make you repent. This too is the period that we have already assigned for cutting timber. Other kinds of work, again, may be found for the hours of the night, which are then so greatly prolonged. There are baskets, hurdles, and panniers to be woven, and wood to be cut for torches. Squared stays for the vine may be prepared too, 30 in the daytime, and if rounded, as many as 60. In the long hours of the evening, too, some 5 squared stays or 10 rounded ones may be got ready, and the same number while the day is breaking. Chapter 64. Work to be done between the winter solstice and the prevalence of the west winds. Between the winter solstice and the period when the west winds begin to prevail, the following, according to Caesar, are the most important signs afforded by the constellations. The dog sets in the morning upon the 3rd day before the calends of January, a day on the evening of which the eagle sets to the people of Attica and the adjoining countries. On the day before the nones of January, according to Caesar's computation, the dolphin rises in the morning, and on the next day the lyre, upon the evening of which the arrow sets to the people of Egypt. Upon the 6th day before the Ides of January, the dolphin sets in the evening, and Italy has many days of continuous cold. The same is the case also when the sun enters Aquarius about the 16th day before the calends of February. On the 8th before the calends of February, the star which Tubero calls the royal star sets in the morning in the breast of Leo, and in the evening of the day before the nones of February, the lyre sets. During the latter days of this period, whenever the nature of the weather will allow of it, the ground should be turned up with a double mattock for planting the rose and the vine, 60 men to a jugerum. Ditches too should be cleaned out, or new ones made, and the time of daybreak may be usefully employed in sharpening iron tools, fitting on handles, repairing such dolia as may have been broken, and rubbing up and cleaning their staves. Chapter 65. Work to be done between the prevalence of the west winds and the vernal equinox. Between the prevalence of the west winds and the vernal equinox, the 14th day before the calends of March, according to Caesar, announces 3 days of changeable weather. The same is the case too with the 8th before the calends of March, at the first appearance of the swallow, Arcturus rising on the evening of the next day. Caesar has observed that the same takes place on the 3rd before the nones of March, at the rising of Cancer, and most authorities say the same with reference to the immersion of the vintager. On the 8th before the Ides of March, the northern limb of Pisces rises, and on the next day Orion, at which period also in Attica the kite is first seen. Caesar has noted too the setting of Scorpio on the Ides of March, a day that was so fatal to him, and on the 15th before the calends of April, the kite appears in Italy. On the 12th before the calends of April, the horse sets in the morning. This interval of time is a period of extreme activity for the agriculturist, and affords him a great number of occupations, in reference to which, however, he is extremely liable to be deceived. He is summoned to the commencement of these labors, not upon the day on which the west winds ought to begin, but upon the day on which they really do begin to blow. This moment, then, must be looked for with the most careful attention, as it is a signal which the deity has vouchsafed us in this month, attended with no doubts or equivocations, if only looked for with scrupulous care. We have already stated in the 2nd book the quarter in which this wind blows, and the exact point from which it comes, and before long we shall have occasion to speak of it again still more in detail. In the meantime, however, setting out from that day, whatever it may happen to be, on which the west winds begin to prevail, for it is not always on the 7th before the Ides of February that they do begin, whether in fact they begin to blow before the usual time, as is the case with an early spring, or whether after, which generally happens when the winter is prolonged, there are subjects innumerable to engage the attention of the agriculturist, and those, of course, should be the first attended to, which will admit of no delay. 3-month wheat must now be sown, the vine pruned in the way we have already described, the olive carefully attended to, fruit trees put in and grafted, vineyards cleaned and hoed, seedlings laid out and replaced in the nursery by others, the reed, the willow, and the broom planted and lopped, and the elm, the poplar, and the plane planted in manner already mentioned. At this period also the crops of corn ought to be weeded, and the winter kinds, spelt more particularly, well hoed. In doing this there is a certain rule to be observed, the proper moment being when 4 blades have made their appearance, and with the bean this should never be done until 3 leaves have appeared above ground. Even then, however, it is a better plan to clean them only with a slight hoeing, in preference to digging up the ground, but in no case should they ever be touched the first 15 days of their blossom. Barley must never be hoed except when it is quite dry. Take care, too, to have all the pruning done by the vernal equinox. 4 men will be sufficient for pruning a jugerum of vineyard, and each hand will be able to train 15 vines to their trees. At this period, too, attention should be paid to the gardens and rose beds, subjects which will be separately treated of in succeeding books. Due care should be given to ornamental gardening as well. It is now, too, the very best time for making ditches. The ground should now be opened for future purposes, as we find recommended by Virgil in particular, in order that the sun may thoroughly warm the clods. It is a piece of even more sound advice, which recommends us to plow no lands in the middle of spring, but those of middling quality. For if this is done with a rich soil, weeds will be sure to spring up in the furrows immediately, and if, on the other hand, it is a thin, meager land, as soon as the heat comes on it will be dried up, and so lose all the moisture, which should be reserved to nourish the seed when sown. It is a much better plan, beyond a doubt, to plow such soils as these in autumn. Cato lays down the following rules for the operations of spring. Ditches, he says, should be dug in the seed plots, vines should be grafted, and the elm, the fig, the olive, and other fruit trees planted in dense and humid soils. Such meadows as are not irrigated must be manured in a dry moon, protected from the western blasts, and carefully cleaned. Noxious weeds must be rooted up, fig trees cleared, new seed plots made, and the old ones dressed. All this should be done before you begin to hoe the vineyard. When the pear is in blossom, too, you should begin to plow where it is a meager, gravelly soil. When you have done all this, you may plow the more heavy, watery soils, doing this the last of all. The proper time for plowing, then, is denoted by these 2 signs: the earliest fruit of the lentisk making its appearance, and the blossoming of the pear. There is a third sign, however, as well, the flowering of the squill among the bulbous, and of the narcissus among the garland plants. For both the squill and the narcissus, as well as the lentisk, flower 3 times, denoting by their first flowering the first period for plowing, by the second flowering the second, and by the third flowering the last. In this way it is that one thing affords hints for another. There is one precaution, too, that is by no means the least important among them all, not to let ivy touch the bean while in blossom, for at this period the ivy is noxious to it and most baneful in its effects. Some plants again afford certain signs which bear reference more particularly to themselves. The fig, for instance. When a few leaves only are found shooting from the summit like a cup in shape, then it is more particularly that the fig tree should be planted. Chapter 66. Work to be done after the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox appears to end on the 8th day before the calends of April. Between the equinox and the morning rising of the Vergiliae, the calends of April announce, according to Caesar, stormy weather. Upon the 3rd before the nones of April, the Vergiliae set in the evening in Attica, and the day after in Boeotia, but according to Caesar and the Chaldeans, upon the nones. In Egypt at this time, Orion and his sword begin to set. According to Caesar, the setting of Libra on the 6th before the Ides of April announces rain. On the 14th before the calends of May, the Succulae set to the people of Egypt in the evening, a stormy constellation, and significant of tempests both by land and sea. This constellation sets on the 16th in Attica, and on the 15th according to Caesar, announcing 4 days of bad weather in succession. In Assyria it sets upon the 12th before the calends of May. This constellation has ordinarily the name of Paralisium, from the circumstance that the 11th before the calends of May is observed as the natal day of the city of Rome. Upon this day, too, fine weather generally returns, and gives us a clear sky for our observations. The Greeks call the Succulae by the name of Hyades, in consequence of the rain and clouds which they bring with them, while our people, misled by the resemblance of the Greek word to another word of theirs meaning a pig, have imagined that the constellation receives its name from that word, and have consequently given it in their ignorance the name of Succulae, or the little pigs. In the calculations made by Caesar, the 8th before the calends of May is a day remarked, and on the 7th before the calends, the constellation of the Kids rises in Egypt. On the 6th day before the calends, the Dog sets in the evening in Boeotia and Attica, and the Lyre rises in the morning. On the 5th before the calends of May, Orion has wholly set to the people of Assyria, and on the 4th before the calends, the Dog. On the 6th before the nones of May, the Succulae rise in the morning, according to the calculation of Caesar, and on the 8th before the Ides, the she-goat, which announces rain. In Egypt, the Dog sets in the evening of the same day. Such are pretty nearly the movements of the constellations up to the 6th before the Ides of May, the period of the rising of the Vergiliae. In this interval of time, during the first 15 days, the agriculturist must make haste and do all the work for which he has not been able to find time before the vernal equinox. And he should bear in mind that those who are late in pruning their vines are exposed to jibes and taunts, in imitation of the note of the bird of passage known to us as the cuckoo, for it is looked upon as a disgrace, and one that subjects him to well-merited censure, for that bird upon its arrival to find him only then pruning his vines. Hence it is too that we find those cutting jokes, of which our peasantry are the object, at the beginning of spring. Still, however, all such jokes are to be looked upon as most abominable, from the ill omens they convey. In this way, then, we see that in agricultural operations the most trifling things are construed as so many hints applied us by nature. The latter part of this period is the proper time for sowing panic and millet. The precise moment, however, is just after the barley has ripened. In the case of the very same land, too, there is one sign that points in common both to the ripening of the barley and the sowing of panic and millet, the appearance of the glow-worm shining in the fields at night, since Citylay is the name given by the country people to these flying stars, while the Greeks call them Lampyrides, another manifestation of the incredible bounteousness of nature. And at this point, not even halfway through the agricultural year, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Natural History of Pliny. If you'd like to read this fascinating work for yourself, you'll find a link to all 6 volumes available at Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.